everyone. My name is Inakshi Sopti and I'm the Chief Executive Officer of the Asia Society India Centre. I'm pleased to welcome you all to the third session of our program series titled Safeguarding the Present for a Sustainable Future, very generously supported by TCG Life Sciences Private Limited. Through this four-part series, we aim to convene discussions about sustainable practices in the Indian business sector. These programs host key individuals and experts who are leading the way in ensuring a balanced and sustainable growth story of India at a time when the global economy is recovering from the COVID-19 pandemic. Our program today will discuss India's sustainable startups and entrepreneurial initiatives. We will focus on investors, regulatory frameworks, and growth potential for these startups and their invaluable role in designing a sustainable and climate-conscious future. Entrepreneurial motivation, investment drive, accelerator models, and consumer markets will be some deliberative areas of this program. We will also discuss what opportunities and challenges sustainable startups face in India, and what are some key learnings for those who aspire to be one of them. I'd like to thank our outreach partners for this program, Makers Asylum and Atal Incubation Center of Goa Institute of Management. We have the honor of hosting a truly distinguished panel to discuss today's subject. Please allow me to introduce our speakers. Anita M George is Executive Vice President and Deputy Head of CDPQ Global. She also sits on CDPQ's Investment Risk Committee. Prior to her current role, she's held multiple positions: Executive Vice President and Head of Strategic Partnership at Growth Markets, Senior Director of the World Bank's Energy and Extractive Industries Global Practice, Head of Siemens Financial Services in India, and Director of Infrastructure and Natural Resources of the International Finance Corporation, a member of the World Bank Group. Pratap Raju is the founding partner of Climate Collective. He's been in the climate and clean tech space since 2009. From being one of the pioneers in solar since the early days of the National Solar Mission, he has pivoted to supporting climate and clean tech startups throughout South Asia, where the Climate Collective has accelerated over 600 plus startups across the region. Ajaita Shah is the founder and CEO of Frontier Markets. She's an entrepreneur and mentor driving vision, strategy, investments, and partnerships. Ajaita has extensive experience in social enterprises and in rural microfinance, distribution, marketing, and access. She's on the board of Frontier Innovations Foundation and Shine Invest, and she's a recipient of prestigious awards, including Forbes 30 Under 30, Social Entrepreneur of the Year. Ankit Singhvi leads the cell business at Ola Electric. He's a serial entrepreneur and thought leader in clean tech. He was co-founder and CEO of Mozev. He sold his first venture, NN4 Energy, to the then AIM-listed Mitra. Ankit was part of the founding team of Sunborn Energy, and prior to that, he worked at McKinsey in North America, where he advised clients on low-carbon pathways. And our moderator this evening is Paula Mariwala, founding partner at Aureolis Ventures, which invests in innovative companies focused on social and environmental impact. An alumnus of Stanford University, Paula is co-founder and president emeritus of Stanford Angels and Entrepreneurs India, the managing director of Seed Fund Advisors, and promoter director of Hinditron Group of Companies. She has over 25 years of entrepreneurial and operational experience and over 15 years of investing experience in early stage companies in the US and India. A tiny bit of housekeeping before we proceed. All those who are joining us on Zoom, please leave your questions in the Q&A box and not the chat box. And for our audiences on Facebook, please drop them in the comments section. And with that, Paula, over to you.
Thank you, Inakshi, for the kind introductions. And thank you, Asia Society, for inviting me to moderate this panel and discuss this very important issue of the role that startups will play in accelerating sustainability in our ecosystem. As we come to the close of 2021 with the shadow of the pandemic still looming over us, there is definite recognition of the fragility of our existence. There is also acknowledgement of the fact that climate change is very real, and building climate resilience and adopting sustainable solutions is not an option today. We have to achieve it, and we can do that by changing the spine of our carbon-fueled economy by one part by renewables. There is consensus for this across the globe, across political spectrum, across policymakers, scientists, innovators, and civil society at large. However, Rome wasn't built in a day. This is going to be difficult. It's not as easy as it sounds. Historically, when there have been pivotal shifts in human civilizations, whether it was the mechanical transformation of the Industrial Revolution or the IT revolution, which is embedded digital transformation in all aspects of our lives, innovation and entrepreneurship has played a key role to drive these changes. And the four pillars really required to accelerate this sustainable infrastructure for a green economy that we're talking about are indeed innovation in technology and business model, access to capital, institutional capital of the patient kind and the risk-taking kind, a behavioral change and adoption, which is usually step change but requires a whole ecosystem to promote it, and an enabling environment with favorable and consistent policy framework with public, private, and industry academia partnerships. And last but not the least, a focus on inclusive and equitable growth. As mentioned by Inakshi, our distinguished panel today represents a nice cross-section across all these pillars. So I'm going to start with our energetic entrepreneurs, energized, of course, by the energy of the renewable kind, Ajaita and Ankit. Ajaita, let's start with you. You've been a green entrepreneur in rural India for almost a decade now, and you started by providing clean energy solutions to last mile villages. Can you share a little bit about your extraordinary journey as an entrepreneur over all these years and the opportunities and challenges for sustainable inclusive development in rural India that you've witnessed so far? Over to you.
Thank you so much, Paula, and good evening to everyone. Good morning to all that are coming in. And again, thank you, Asia Society, for organizing, I think, a really critical topic of the hour. So, I'll just take a step back and say, as Paula, you mentioned, I started Frontier Markets about 10 years ago. And the goal really was to connect rural customers to quality, affordable impact solutions at their doorstep. In India, 800 million rural customers do not access high quality solutions that can address their daily challenges to achieve economic empowerment. And to address this, we've invested in onboarding rural women entrepreneurs, or our Saral Jeevan Sahelis, who use our social commerce technology to collect data, showcase solutions, and help fulfill deliveries to these rural customers. Today, 15,000 Sahelis have helped over 500,000 rural families adopt 5 million plus solutions. Our entry point has always started from energy access. India has massively shifted from electrification challenges, where there is zero electricity, to unreliable or inefficient electricity in rural India. This ultimately leads to high levels of kerosene and other carbon-intensive alternatives, as well as a massive wastage on poor quality solutions. So we've addressed this by really introducing solar lighting systems, clean cook stoves, and low energy consumption appliances. About 1.5 million of these solutions have helped reduce over 605,000 carbon tons of carbon emission. I started this because I've seen way too many kerosene fires. Amazing rural women miss income opportunities in over 5,000 villages of India in my 20s, where I moved to India after being born in America and understood the realities of privilege and opportunity and lack of infrastructure. I strongly believe that if we shift our lens from seeing rural families as beneficiaries, but to dignified customers, and rural women as social influencers and service providers, we can create a massive marketplace in rural India and really address climate challenges in the country.
Great, Ajaita. I mean, that's a fantastic vantage to understand what's happening in rural India today. Ankit, you also started a few years ago, one of the early starters in the renewable space, and you kind of pioneered the whole shift from internal combustion to electric vehicles early on. Why don't you also share your journey and where you are today, and how have you seen this whole sector evolve as you navigated from the early days?
Yeah, thank you, Paula. Good evening, everyone. And I'll take you through my journey, which started, I would say, from one of the speeches that I heard at IIT Bombay when I was a student there from President Abdul Kalam. And he had launched his book of 2020, and he said he had a vision of India being a developed economy, right? And as a chemical engineer, I said energy looks exciting because if you have to become a developed economy, we have to really solve the energy challenges, whether it's energy access, energy availability. I didn't start with clean energy, right? That was never the starting point. But what I realized through that journey is if India has to grow sustainably, I think clean energy is the only way. Sustainability is the only way, because there's some really interesting points, right? We pay more for electricity, and these were all, I would say, the aha moment of why I got into entrepreneurship, which was when I moved back to India. What we realized, I moved to Delhi, Gurgaon. The air was obviously not clean, but the whole, what was some really interesting statistics was I was paying more for electricity than what I was paying in US. And we have our income levels are much lower compared to US economy. We pay more for fuel than I think what people pay in Western economies. And from that perspective, it's a no-brainer that we have to, look for clean energy solutions which are more profitable. So my journey, when I looked at renewables, there was no policy at that point of time back in 2009. So similarly, when Pratap talked about solar mission, the early days. And what I realized was there's a big disconnect where there's a solid business case because we pay more for electricity. Always the challenge for clean tech has been the profitability piece, right? I don't believe in subsidies, so I believe that profitable solutions have to be scaled up. And so I saw there was a market opportunity, but what was lacking clearly was ecosystem, availability of investor capital, who looks at new emerging technologies. And that really got me down to my first entrepreneurial journey with my first company focusing on innovation. And, I happen to be a marathon runner. So every time I used to run outside in Delhi, I used to get sick. And the question started why we don't have electric vehicles, right? We have pollution. It's not a climate change issue. I think in India, sustainability is more of a livelihood and, basic, I would say, rights, right? So what I realized on electric vehicles, there were no electric vehicles in India, which was very surprising. We import all diesel, we have congestion. So we said, let's start looking at buses. So as a company, Mozev, we were the first company in India to commercially run electric buses back in 2016 on Manali Rohtang, where all the leading players, all the leading OEMs said, you can't do it. And I think that's one thing which entrepreneurs always keep hearing, that it's not doable or there are all these challenges. Well, long story short, from that day, there was no policy. Now we have policies in place. And I think today where we are, I think it's a historic opportunity. I think India is best positioned to capitalize on this whole transition. And I'm really excited. Entrepreneurs have to lead the way, because centralized, we can't wait 50, 60 years for government to build it out. We have to build it out in next 10, 15 years. So I see tremendous amount of opportunities. And today, now, after selling, and I will share my challenges later on, but now where I am today with Ola Electric, I lead the cell business. So you would have heard about the scooters, and I think really excited to take it to Mission Electric, which is by 2025, no more ICE two-wheelers in the country.
That's a really fantastic positive note, Ankit, and good segue to bring in our investor on the panel, Anita. Anita, you have been an institutional investor with strong focus on sustainability. But traditionally, the capital in this space of sustainability has been for established models, established companies in maybe renewables like wind and solar and so on. There are, of course, lots of startups there now who are trying to really impact this ecosystem. How do you see the flow of capital today, particularly in India? And how do you see this whole landscape shift? And how do you see the whole synergies coming together with the early stage and late stage in this particular sector?
Thank you, Paula. And let me start by thanking the Asia Society for giving me this opportunity. It's truly a privilege hearing Ankit and Ajaita and the great work that they are doing as growing startups, I would say, in this ecosystem of green and clean infrastructure services. It's really heartening to hear both their stories, and a privilege, I would say, for long-term institutional investors like ourselves. CDPQ, as you all may know, is Canada's second largest pension fund manager. We have about 400 billion Canadian dollars under management, and we invest across geographies and across asset classes. So one thing I'm very proud to say is, given CDPQ's DNA of investing in sustainable and in promoting ESG across all our investments, that has been a focus, not a recent one, but one that has been with us since several decades, I would say. So it's part and parcel of our DNA. But the question that you asked, Paula, for a large institutional investor to bring in direct capital investments into the startup ecosystem is a challenge. However, the way we have been tackling that, in fact, I would say in Canada, we are one of the largest LP contributors to the VC industry, and clean tech has been a focus for us. It has been a slow but steady progress also in emerging markets. So we've started in India and China through funds, and I think this is a trend that will continue. Globally, as you know, there's about $43 trillion, which is earmarked as capital for ESG compliant investments. Of course, as institutional investors, this tends to go to the bigger ticket items, since we have lean teams and a large volume of capital to deploy. But the trend that I'm seeing with institutional capital across the board is really a focus on capturing the innovation and ingenuity in the startup ecosystems. And we've done investments in India, China, Israel, looking at potential investments in Brazil through funds to reach the startup systems. We are also encouraging bilateral collaborations between like Indian health tech companies and Canadian health tech companies in the aftermath of COVID to encourage that part of the sustainable ecosystem between the two countries. And I would say that the VC sector itself has been very instrumental, and we can see now many examples of VCs that were focused on climate tech who have done extremely well, are in the first percentage quartile of performance. And as both Ankit and Ajaita mentioned, we are no longer talking about a sustainability premium, but really a sustainability opportunity.
Thanks, Anita. This is, of course, music to the ears of entrepreneurs that, as VC funds are getting LPs who are promoting interest in sustainability. So we're hoping the ecosystem is going to get even more exciting. Is everybody able to hear me? Okay. Pratap, I'm coming to you now. And the reason you are last is because you are the key ecosystem builder. You have a ringside view of what's happening because you interact with all these energetic entrepreneurs with the buzzing with ideas. What are you seeing on the ground? What kind of traction, different sectors are getting? What are the entrepreneurs thinking when they're coming to you with all these ideas? And again, you've been around for a while in this sector. What do you see changed on the ground in the last few years?
Right, great, thank you. And it's an honor to be here with everyone here on the panel. I think I've known each of you separately and through one way or another. And I'd like to thank Asia Society for this honor as well. My kids are also at Makers Lab, one of the outreach partners. So I have so many connections to everything here. I can share what I have seen. I've been an entrepreneur for about 20 years, and from IT to Bollywood to media to everything until about 2009 when the National Solar Mission came up, as mentioned, and it was we raised some capital and put some megawatts on the ground, 84 megawatts, which used to be a big number. When we did this in 2011 and 12, I used to then go to corporates and ask, wouldn't it be great to put solar on your roof? And they would tell me, does solar work? We had a few thousand megawatts on the ground here, 30, 40,000 on the ground. And so many of the people in industry told me it's not something for India. 2 years later, it changed fast. Now, when I, going back to the ecosystem, when I started supporting clean tech startups in 2016, it was our first solar hackathon. Most people told me this is not where you should focus. The bigger areas where it could be health tech or ed tech, many other startup sectors, not clean tech. It's not for business. It's for CSR. It's for doing good. And it was I don't know, maybe a couple of hundred startups then. We started this nonprofit Climate Collective and started supporting entrepreneurs program by program. And something happened on the ground in the last 2-3 years. There's been an explosion of entrepreneurs in this area. We've had 640 startups in our accelerators, post-incubation accelerators since the last 3.5 years, and still hitting 250. This is not a more testament to our platform, but what we see on the ground and the demand across from solar areas like EVs, we're hoping to see more rural energy startups as well, but they're starting to see some technologies come in that space as well. But this is a broad-based change in what we're seeing from back in 2016, which was maybe more focused on energy. In fact, today, circular economy and waste is our biggest sector, and these trends are not growing. So we started to support more startups, and I think I need to mention and Ankit, we need an ecosystem approach. So we launched our angel network back in 2018, Climate Angels Network. We are about to launch our own fund, Climate Seeds, to invest in early stage startups, and even a funders club in March to get that hard to raise 25 lakh to 50 lakh. Not everyone has these friends and families with these pockets, but they may have amazing startups. So we're hoping that comes out strongly in March. But across the board, there's needs, from the startup school. There's so many people today compared to back then who want to be an entrepreneur in climate. So we launched our startup school called Climate Startup School. Right now it's focused on women in energy and women in plastic waste. But we do hope to widen it out to many more would-be or aspiring entrepreneurs here in India. And this demand is perhaps the secular trends are going to be the key trends in the startup ecosystem. I don't want to be one of those guys who keeps doubting clean tech for decades and be disappointed, but I think something has changed in clean tech, and it's this idea that it is a business, that there can be cash flows. Back in the relative failure from 15 years ago in clean tech, especially Silicon Valley, there were huge investments from in organic solar cells to everything I remember in the solar space. The winner turned out to be monocrystalline technology from 1950s, and the companies, the startups, technology players that leveraged that were the ones who created cash flow from this. So I think this we call it clean tech 2.0, I guess, has legs that are different and focused on cash flow and revenues, and much more broad-based compared to the past. So I'm looking forward to seeing how this ecosystem evolves for sure.
Yeah, great, Pratap. Great to hear about all the exciting things happening and things really taking off. I think one of the reasons we are seeing this real big shift in the interest in this sector from investors as well as founders is what I think is a very unique moment in history, where we have digital transformation alongside sustainability, focus on sustainability, and the power of data really fueling this, along with tools like AI, ML, and various other technologies from the software side that we have available. Ankit, I'm going to ask you, how do you see this transformation alongside sustainability really changing the way even things have evolved in, say, the transport sector or supply chain and so on? What are the real opportunities coming up around this move towards, for example, electrification of vehicles, etc.? And what are the challenges as well?
No, so I think, yeah, you're absolutely spot on when you say, and that's why it's a unique moment, right? So one is, of course, the business case has to be there. Like what Pratap was saying, I do believe that cash flows ultimately matters. But with whole digitization of economy, right? Two things are happening. One is on the consumer side, and I think that's the most powerful driver because now consumers are demanding clean solutions, right? So they do believe they're not willing to pay a premium for it, but they're demanding clean solutions, right? And that makes a lot of difference because enterprises have to respond to that, right? It's creating opportunities. Second, what is happening is if I look at the broader trend, which is the whole electrification of economy in general, right? I mean, that's at a very macro level, that's what is happening. So whether it's on the transport side, whether it's on the fuel side, on the industry side, on all different dimensions, there's a broader electrification. What data, digital, what it is doing is it is accelerating the whole trend towards establishing trust, right? Whether the technology works, because now you have data to back it up. So if I have to sell a bus, I remember when the first time we were trying to sell the bus, the question was same, right? Can it go over a flyover, right? I mean, and you say, oh, by the way, the torque is very high. The motor, it's far superior, but people don't, it's very difficult to establish the trust, right? And that really, I would say, is one of the biggest challenges of bringing innovative technology. Once, like in 2010, what Pratap was saying, 84 megawatts was a big number at that point of time, because the plant size were 5 to 10 megawatts, right? Now, if anyone builds below 250 megawatts or 300 megawatts, it's not a scale, right? But what has happened is that trust has come in, that the technology works. So I think what data, digital, AI, all they're doing two things. One, it is accelerating this whole timeline to establish trust that this thing works or doesn't work. And second, what it's doing is it's also helping accelerate the product development. So for example, today, like if you're building a motor, so you talked about supply chain on electrification. If you have to design a motor, the old process was you have to get the tools in place, you have to get extrusion, to get the casing. But now you have robotics, you have data which tells you, okay, these are the three simulations. You can simulate pretty much the whole motor design before you make the actual physical sample, right? And that just cuts down the whole development cycle. It makes it much more resource efficient. That's why you're seeing a lot of startups, because I don't now need to have a large or a manufacturing facility. I can really do simulations and really reduce my capex. So if you ask me on challenges, clearly, the challenges which this data and AI is helping solve is it's making it less capital intensive. So, with 50 lakhs or 1 crore pool of capital, if I have some really good idea, at least I can do some prototyping, right? I can do some prototype. I can take it to the next stage, which I think earlier it was not possible. I would say a few years back also. And the second thing is the whole development cycle, right? So that which establishes, which is critical for entrepreneur or startup, right? To get that first quick win so that you can at least take it to the next level.
Ajaita, I know you really cashed in on the power of data in rural India, which is a really difficult market to work. Can you elaborate on how having data has also improved the way you work, and also how you've given clean energy solutions in a much better way now?
Yeah, sure. So I think just taking a step back for the audience, I mean, rural India's internet presence and smartphone penetration has drastically changed in the last 3 years, right? So that's really what triggered the opportunity to look at what could you do if you digitize data on rural households, right? The challenge that we've always seen in the past to create innovative climate-friendly solutions to be introduced in rural markets has been an access challenge, but also because of that access challenge, most of the innovators, right, the manufacturers that want to create solutions for this massive market, they didn't have deep insights about who these rural families are, what do they actually need, and how do you kind of make that connect to happen. So with digital systems in place and insights-driven data platforms like what Frontier Markets has, we can bridge that divide incredibly, right? And innovate on climate-friendly solutions, track carbon reduction like real time. We can create incentive models to encourage rural families to change their behavior to be more climate friendly and actually track it, right? And so what Frontier Markets has really been able to do is we use our tech platform and we're literally collecting intense data on consumption, how people operate, what could be the small tweaks that you can make to essentially help them become more carbon friendly, and then build those solutions in. And then in parallel, you're using these insights to essentially work with big players, right? Whether that's Schneider, that's Total, whether that's Philips and others, and you're actually giving them insights to design for this mass market. So all of a sudden, you're creating economies of scale because you're actually giving proven data to show that there is a demand. You're creating curated, customized solutions that actually really then create a pull market. So rural customers are actually saying, oh, thank you for designing something for me, and they're buying it. And then on a fundamental level, you're then being able to real-time track this incredible outcomes-based opportunity, which then creates new players, right? So carbon trading, that has been something that kind of died over a period, it's coming back because now all of a sudden, if we say 100 million women can be incentivized to use clean cooking stoves, that is a massive carbon opportunity that you can actually then get a new payer to give you blended capital. So we're seeing new revenue opportunities. We're seeing deeper conversions. We're also seeing innovation come in a really interesting way. And the last thing that I'll say is what's interesting about the point that Pratap made about circular economies. I mean, it's so exciting, right? So if you're able to really leverage on insights and you have a localized supply chain, you really are playing a pivotal role to then build circular economies, right? So what Frontier Markets has been able to do is by simply mapping out all the people that have wasted appliances that are like LED lights and lithium-ion batteries, you can collect all of that and get it to a recycling facility and actually create a new income opportunity. And so this is where we think that their full circle comes in because of tech. If you didn't have that tech piece, if you weren't able to actually get those insights in fast, I don't think we would be able to finally show that the rural marketplace is going to become the largest opportunity for climate because people didn't really understand it or believe it. And now they do. So it's exciting times. Challenges, just really quickly, I'll say, is that there's a lot of data to cover, right? So the problem also is that when you work with rural families, I have 500,000 families and I get almost 10 to 15 million data points a day. So dealing with big data and actually really trying to understand how to use the right lens of ML and AI to create the right algorithms has still not been well established. So you have data scientists that exist, but they don't necessarily have a rural lens or a gender lens that allows us to make conclusive decisions in an automated way. Second challenge I'll say is that still, on a hardware perspective, not everybody has that smartphone, not everybody has that internet, and we're trying to circumvent it by giving lower quality solutions, feature phones. That's not the answer. We need to be a bit more disruptive and just really just take advantage of this internet connectivity in a different level and give those people those phones and give them the tools to be able to give their opinions faster in a more automated way, which could be game changing. So I think those are probably the two challenges that I also see on the digital side.
It really points also at how one can promote inclusive growth using data and technology, and we must get technology in the hands of the consumers. Anita, from the investor lens, are you also seeing different models emerge even in the larger companies which you may have invested in? And is there sort of a faster growth of smaller companies, which gets attention of maybe companies in your portfolio? And also in terms of, Ajaita mentioned carbon trading, which has made a comeback. There is a lot of ESG reporting, and all this is now at a different level with the kind of technology and the data cloud platforms that we have. How are investors really using these opportunities?
Thank you, Paula. And I think listening to Ajaita, I'm sort of provoked to share a story that has created a ecosystem, as Pratap was mentioning, in Montreal, for example, initiated by CDPQ, where we got academicians, startups, as well as companies, industries, many of whom are investee companies, to come together. And the first thing to do that was to provide physical space. So in an abandoned building in Montreal, actually, we created the Machine Learning and Artificial Intelligence Institute in Montreal, and had the magnet in the form of Professor Yoshua Bengio, who is an expert on AI. And with his graduate students, with some startups that emerged around this ecosystem of academia and I would say technical prowess on AI and ML, they were able to attract industry, both big and small. So you had the startups and Facebook, Google, Amazon, all sort of created teams in and around Mila so that they could benefit from the innovation that this ecosystem was generating. So it just strikes me listening to Ajaita and having Pratap here that it makes a lot of sense for us in India to do something similar and create a kind of ecosystem and, especially reaching out to consumers to become more inclusive. And if there is anything we can share from the Mila experience, I would be very happy to connect all of you to that experience. And, Mila hosts like 100 entrepreneurs from different geographies. We've had women entrepreneurs who've come and spent time. And that really kind of creates, I would say, all the building blocks that's needed to inspire and motivate new entrepreneurs in these areas. So that's one. On a global scale, the importance of data has become very evident. And as the old saying goes, it's when you measure something that you can actually see results. And I'm happy to share that during COP26, the Sustainability Standards Board, which is created by the IFRS Foundation, has been launched. Excuse me. It's going to be situated in Montreal, and the focus is on coming up with ESG parameters on the E, the S, as well as G, which can be followed by companies. And we already have some of the Fortune 500 companies who've signed up to following these metrics, measuring, having them verified by third party, and most important, disclosing publicly how they are performing against these metrics. So I think with more and more emphasis on measurement, on data, on disclosure, this will become more of a trend and a mainstream. And my hope is that just as much as the large Fortune 500 and Fortune 1000 companies are coming on board, it will also incentivize smaller companies. And we have within CDPQ initiatives to help smaller companies achieve those standards and metrics, as well as, the rural consumer, who I think, especially in India, is very important and a powerful group that to be catered to. So it's great to hear what Ajaita and Pratap and Ankit have shared.
And I think I'd like to add one more point here, Paula and Anita. What is interesting is because we mentioned about data. If you look at 10 years back, right, the challenge with people who are on the lower income group or rural access, right, they didn't have any credit history. So it's very interesting that they pay more for energy. So their cost of like what we pay in cities, they pay probably 2x or 3x on energy, right? Even more. Now, if you look at clean energy, fundamentally the paradigm changes, right? Because now it's capital cost. The operating cost is substantially lower. So Selco, which was pioneer like Harish Hande, what he was doing with women entrepreneurs in Karnataka, right? Where they established that they were willing to pay on an OPEX model, these solar lanterns, solar lights. And I'm talking of 15 to 18 years back, right? I mean, now the cost structures are very different. So what is happening with, and especially in India with Aadhaar and Jan Dhan account and everything, what is happening is over a period of time, there is some sort of credit history which is getting built, right? And that's where the question of trust. So Now you have solutions which are commercially viable, profitable. They were earlier also profitable with those type of cost structures, but now when the fintech revolution happens with this data, I think that is going to be transformative, and it cannot be centralized. It has to be distributed, right? And that's why you see more and more entrepreneurs taking on that. And I think that's going to be quite exciting.
So just 2 points that I would just want to bring to maybe contradicts a little bit of what Ankit you're saying is that, so yes, there are Jan Dhan Yojana bank accounts, and yes, there are, systems for digital payments. The fact of the matter is that the cost of what we're trying to introduce in terms of climate solutions is so significantly higher on a cash perspective that you're actually not being able to leverage digital payments at all. And so therefore there is no credit history that you're talking about that actually exists. And I can verify this for like multiple states in the country. It's not working in the way that we want it to work, right? So it is an ecosystem challenge on how do we incentivize rural customers to adapt and change their behavior. So incentivizing them in a different way, I think, does enable the ability to unlock capital. We have been using that rhetoric. We've been saying that if you start enabling us to really leverage your data well, we can then become instrumental in helping you unlock capital in a way that I think hasn't happened before. And then just the other point on the Selcos type of stories is that the challenge that I've seen is that we haven't been able to do an economies of scale story, right? So we create a lot of really interesting one-off solutions, innovative solutions, right? And it's everything from like a solar air dryer to a solar freezer or whatnot. But because we haven't reached that economies of scale, we haven't actually been able to create that parity of cost of capital for energy and actually then be creating that incentive structure. So our goal has been that how do we get everyone that has entrepreneurs, everybody that cares about climate, and bring them all together on one like cohesive ecosystem to just rapidly build that economies of scale, collect that data, and then actually help some of these innovators create based on that volume, because you'll drastically reduce the price. I mean, that's what happened with EESL and LED lights, right? I mean, that was the game changer when you were investing in that economies of scale because you were certain that there was a market demand, right? And so somewhere it's about bridging those pieces so that we can actually see scale for real happen, right? Because we talk about 800 million customers. We talk about this all the time in India. We have so much power and muscle. We're just not reaching it because we're just not thinking that way in terms of data, marketplace, and opportunities. So that's just the other thing I want to just add.
Yeah, no, I mean, scale is very important. And, Pratap, you have a bunch of entrepreneurs you work with. What is it that they really struggle with the most? Is it, figuring out how to get scale? Because this is a difficult ecosystem, right? It's not as easy as launching an app. What kind of, as an accelerator, what kind of really helped you give them? And again, coming back to data, is that making life easier for the entrepreneurs to find models that work and that scale?
Right.
Maybe I'll just give anecdotes. We would love to hear some real examples.
Right. Let me just start with a second with some quick plugs. Ankit mentioned data first. We have a AI for Climate Accelerator for the UK government currently outstanding for carbon reduction and energy management. So if you do know AI startups, do check them out. Also, I'm part of a group called New Energy Nexus globally, and we have a climate fintech program that is now coming to India where we're trying to solve end user financing. And I think, Ajaita, with all that you're doing, this sounds like a good way to marry everything you're doing with what we can do to help on the fintech side. And maybe just a small little thing, Anita mentioned this idea that this new platform in Montreal of bringing people together in a very modest way in Goa. We have a new hub here called Climate Hub in Goa, or Hub CE, in partnership with GIM, who's one of the outreach partners here. So it's free to anyone who works in clean tech to come and work there in Goa. So finishing all the plugs. So yeah, it's going to what it's like being a clean tech entrepreneur. I have been myself, as the panelists here as well, and it's a hard journey. It's hard because you pass through what Ankit said at first about even do electric buses go over speed bumps, right? There are many challenges that you would get funding sooner, maybe in other areas, when in a lot of B2B solutions and rural solutions, which is majority perhaps of our clean tech startups, the sales cycle is long. Especially B2B, and investors normally don't like this. It takes, if you said it takes a year and a half to be onboarded to a large domestic or MNC after pilots, etc., who's going to fund all this? So we do have a challenge. It's getting better for sure as capital is starting to come out. We are seeing, of course, in particular areas like mobility, of course, not just in India, globally, capital coming much faster. But there's a lot of clean tech where, because of the sales cycle, because of the newness of the problems, who's supporting the wastewater technologies? These are things that we do need to solve, and there are technologies coming out. Even they could be data solutions, IoT, etc. But still, it's an area that's of less comfort to many, for example, investors. So I think one of the things we try to do is figure out how to connect to the right resources, and it is piloting. If you told me one thing we need to do is help get piloting on the ground. Now, of course, we need the capital, we need capacity training, many things, but I think today, given we estimate 2,500 startups, clean tech startups in India, there's probably 1,500. I think that was tracked in public papers. 2,500 is a big number, and it's let's say will double every 18 months. It's absolutely crazy. These entrepreneurs need as much help as possible in an area where perhaps it's easier to do something else. There's a reason most of the entrepreneurs that I see are doing this. It is around impact, like in particular Ajaita, when she started off, I am sure it looked nothing like it does today. And in fact, I know about frontier markets through a common friend over the years, so I know about the journey. I would say that one of the things that is starting to happen, we could accelerate, is increasing these connections to corporates or demand. In particular, there's specialized capital that is there, sitting there, for example, in water. How do you find the right entrepreneurs to support them? Our programs on women in particular, we've seen that when we started off, it was something like 6 or 8% of the entrepreneurs who came to our programs were women. Now, through concerted kind of interventions, it's going to 30%. Now we're trying to solve the funding gaps, and there are gaps here. Looking at the quality of startups, there is something, preventing at least early stage capital from going to more women. So I think it's a matter of plugging nonstop, finding these problems to be solved, but recognizing it's not an easy journey. And that's true. I've met a lot of entrepreneurs, even not in clean tech. Startups are not easy. Can I ask
a question? Can I jump in for a second, Pratap? I want to ask you a question directly. Double click on one point that you brought in, because I think it's an interesting reality. Like, I start looking at all these clean tech startups, and a lot of them are, as you rightfully said, designing innovative solutions, right? And their challenge is market access, right? Their challenge is being able to test their products to see whether there's a product market fit, and also to be able to have that certainty that there could in fact be this like large customer base. And so an investor that comes in tends to want to see volume, but there's that, as you rightfully said, that chicken and egg challenge of if I don't have capital, how can I test my products and take it to market? But, and then, so they come to companies like us, right? They go, you guys have 500,000 customers, you have 10 million customers or whatever. Let's put our product on your platform. But we too also need to test the product viability. So do you see that as being something that maybe philanthropy can play a role on, like R&D, go-to-market innovation, promoting pilots? Like, have you seen any kind of traction on that? And would that change a lot of the initial struggles that some of your entrepreneurs are maybe facing?
And maybe what the role governments and educational institutions of governments, research institutions, where they can play, and also research and funding arms of corporates. Is that something you're seeing, Pratap? And maybe Anita, you can also weigh in here.
Right. And maybe just quickly on that. I think clean tech looks different than what it did 10 years ago. If you told me where's the foundation money, I would say look for the private capital. It has changed, not for every solution, especially certain problem areas will always need philanthropic or development capital, but much of clean tech, we would have run to government or philanthropy much faster 10 years ago than today. Those numbers that have astounded all of us. I think the target is we're seeing maybe $49 billion globally coming into clean tech startups this year. This was 100x from 2013, roughly, not including CVC, corporate venture capital. So something amazing is happening. So I think what we're seeing is increasing, or maybe too slow, but maturity of investors taking more risks. I think the capital is lying for many cleantech areas on the private side. Governments are strapped for sure. I don't think that's where most entrepreneurs are going. What you have mentioned last, Paula, is right. There's a lot more corporate interest in startups for sure compared to just 3-4 years ago. And some have actually mobilized low internal capital to look at solutions or business. This is all great. It is not our ecosystem. Our ecosystem is maybe 1 to 3 years younger than that. Before corporate says, let's pilot. There's a long journey in clean tech. It's a in the funding side, it's at best, mostly a pre-Series A economy, right? With which means you have a little bit of sales and some pilot sales, etc. Of course, we have some later stage funding coming in for later stage startups, but the bulk is quite early. I think we still need a lot of bridges to build. And where we're trying to focus on is really increasing the investor education of angels. And in fact, without us doing it, it's starting to move. 2 years ago, before COVID, I went to one of the largest angel networks and I asked them what you're interested in. Shockingly, and you may know this, Paula, more than me with your experience, they told me 2 years ago, the number one focus was sustainability, backed by their internal angel fund too. And for someone who struggled to see support, this was amazing to hear. And COVID happened, but it didn't really slow at least funding down. Still not enough. If we increase our capital from private sector by 10 times, there will still be hundreds of entrepreneurs who probably can't get access to that capital. But at least we're moving in the right direction. I think our goal now is to nurture this more, finding it to the right, better entrepreneurs, in particular, making it more inclusive. One of our strategies is not to focus just on the big 3 metro areas. There is talent everywhere in India. In 2019, we did run one program in 15 states. 15 states and Maldives. Now, Maldives is smaller than the neighborhood I was living in Bombay, and Bandera is half the size, but still amazing entrepreneurs there, given what problems they're solving. They're trying to solve big problems in a small country, waste. So I think everyone, this is a complex problem. There is a role for government, more corporate funding and support coming in for sure. But the hard challenge is actually where Ajaita is working. I wish there would be more capital to go to more of the energy access areas. Most investors don't. EVs and other sectors do take more. So we have a lot more work to do in particular in these areas.
Anita, what role do you think the government can play besides, of course, giving a platform or giving some schemes, but also for investors, for making it a more enabling environment for investors to come in?
I think one of the key factors is really consistency and stability in regulations. Sometimes certain steps, like in the past of changing the tax regime for angel investors, etc., it may be seen as a small blip, but it can set back the industry and the sector. So I would say, as an investor, even more than an existing regulation, what really unnerves us is when there is frequent change in regulation and when you cannot predict what the regulatory environment will be. This goes for the whole ecosystem of investing, but it also holds for sectoral regulations, whether it's on EV, renewable energy, etc. So I would say, first and foremost, what I would ask the government is stay out of micromanagement, have clear-cut policies and stick to them. And if there is a change to be made with good rationale and logic, then grandfather what you've allowed under the old regime. I think if we can follow a few of these very basic principles, that will give investors a huge amount of confidence that they can come into these sectors. What's powerful in India is the market, and whether we are talking about urban or rural, there is a very large addressable market. And I think one of the things that I see would be very useful is creating collectives and collaboration, because more and more there are all the sources of capital that Pratap mentioned, from the philanthropies to the endowments to also HNIs. And one of the things I see in India is that we are all turning to global funders, but I think we have to figure out a way to kickstart the Indian HNIs and the Indian ecosystem, the Indian pension funds. For example, the Canadian pension funds are more active in green infrastructure in India than the Indian pension funds. Why is that? And so I think, and getting in that domestic capital, it's good from a long-term point of view. It's also good because as foreign investors get a lot of comfort from seeing local investors who know the local ecosystem actually putting their money where their mouth is. And I truly believe that if we can unlock domestic capital, we'll get even more international capital to come into these nascent sectors.
It's a very important point about domestic capital, which has really not been that active. Of course, it's very active now in early stage, but not in all sectors. Ankit, on that note, this government has really focused, or at least has made large announcements around policies for electrifying transport sector. And world over, I think that the transition from IC to EV the initial part has been backed largely by government incentives and policies. Can you elaborate a little bit on what it is like in India? Is it really sort of impacting, because one is seeing a lot of action, of course, in the EV sector. We see EV companies pitching to us all the time. But is there true innovation, and is there true opportunity to scale? And I think there's also a question on the Q&A box that what about the infrastructure needed to really make this transition? Who is going to look into that? Or, are we really going to be able to have global numbers which justify our focus on EV?
So I think, I'll start with people don't trust government, right? So, and I think the fundamental difference between renewable energy, what I have seen, and EV is more consumer-led. And I think India has the best policy for a simple reason that today all the government budget is based on taxes on fuel, right? So if you look at today, we pay, governments can't reduce taxes on diesel and petrol, right? And I remember because when we did the first bus, buses were not part of FAME. So once we successfully ran it, then I also was inducted into this National Board on Electric Mobility, which set the whole policy on FAME too. And what I think is government has done pretty much whatever they had to do on the policy side. And the best thing which they have done is the petrol prices and diesel prices are so high, right? And they're not going to come down. So whether crude prices go up and down, in India, the diesel prices and petrol prices will keep going up, or they will be at, now the baseline has shifted to 100. There are no protests, right? I mean, people are accepted that 100 rupees is the baseline. And I think that's great, right? If I look at from an infrastructure also, I don't believe government. So just to give everyone a perspective, if every single vehicle in India is tomorrow electrified, the power demand requirement will only go up by 20,000 megawatt, right? India has a base of upwards of 300,000 megawatt of power generation, right? So at a macro level, even if you electrify all the vehicles, we are talking only 20,000 megawatt, right? It's not really, it's not something, it's readily available. I think we have almost 50,000 megawatt of stranded assets, if I look at coal and other gas assets. But the bigger thing is, and that's why I believe why entrepreneurs will play that role. Historically, the whole development process has been very centralized. So it took 50 to 60 years to build out grid, and still in India, the grid is being built out. But if you look at globally, the trend is it has to become more decentralized. And that's why what matters is you can't have one lens to say, and I read the question that what do I do about charging infrastructure? Yes, charging infrastructure is a relevant question to ask, but I think it is very contextual to the end user, right? And if I try to segment the market, instead of expecting government to build out charging infrastructure in all cities, highways, which will take, I don't know how many years or decades. I think what needs to happen is you have to look at what is your requirement. Are you a personal, do you use it for personal vehicle? Is it commercial fleet? And hence, how much is the reliability? Now the product, like the Ola scooter that has just been launched, the range is about 150 kilometers. People drive on an average 20 or 30 kilometers, which is also on the higher side. So what is happening is consumers have to really, really say it or deliver this message by how they purchase. But I don't think the government has to play a big role. I mean, government, they may say, but I don't believe that government will be able to deliver at the pace that we are looking at. But all the policy, I think it's the unit economics are great. Probably India is the best market for electrification. If you ask me purely on a P&L perspective, obviously the question about how do you finance it, how do you enable it, and I think it has to be distributed. It cannot be a centralized approach.
Ankit, I just saw a report which said that 10 years ago, 0.002% of all new vehicles were electric. And today it's 1 in 10 globally. So I think
whatever. So I don't know, I was at McKinsey and I'm not very proud to say that, but when the whole mobile revolution happened, there were all these studies which said that, there'll be so many mobile phones that, it's human tendency. We look at things linearly. I think the disruption happens non-linearly. So my sense is all the timelines, people started, it will take 2050. Then after 1 year, it said 2040. Now companies are announcing 2035. Some cities have announced, like London or UK have said 2030. I think it will exceed everyone's expectation. The cat is out of the bag. The technologies are, most of the technologies, I'm not saying, but most of the technologies are at a scale, are proven enough that you can have now build solutions and innovations around it, right? I mean, the technology piece and all the enabling factors are, I think we have tremendous amount.
Yeah, the McKinsey study, I think, predicted less than 1 million phones in 2000. This was commissioned by AT&T back in, I think, late 80s. Yeah, so, and I think, as we know, we're obviously way, way ahead. Ajaita, there are, talking about the government, there are also lots of government schemes, particularly aimed at the rural consumer, which have enabled companies like yours, and but there are also roadblocks. So again, a quick view on how governments can really enable startups, which are really difficult sectors and difficult, consumer sectors as well.
Yeah, just one thought that was clicking my mind as Ankit was speaking, and kind of linking it back to what Anita was saying earlier on the ESG side. It is interesting to think through, like a lot of companies like us that are supply chain companies, logistics companies that are essentially going into deep rural areas on scooters. Do our LPs or investors end up taking an ESG lens where they start mandating a shift, right, from diesel to electric, right? And how can Pratap facilitate that, right? I mean, this is like an idea that I'm going to incept in everyone's mind, because I do think it's a really interesting opportunity when you start thinking about where supply chain goes, especially in rural markets, right? And being able to take that leadership or responsibility. To your question, Paula, so we've had an interesting journey with government in terms of politics versus policy. And it all depends on where we think about these pieces, right? So like on the gender lens piece, for example, I think the government has had really interesting conversions, especially post-COVID, where there have been enough schemes and intentionalities to create livelihood opportunities for rural women, right? So the self-help group network is 165 million women, and there have been very distinct programmatic policies that have been in place to support skills development, training, entrepreneurship, and access to capital in a way that we're still navigating, but I think is a huge opportunity to really work with government to start bridging that divide. On the clean energy side, I think to Anita's point, it's been frustrating because we've gone from different taxation policies, right? I mean, there were certain states that had 0% VAT. which then when introduced GST, and all of a sudden solar appliances and products are, getting taxed at 12 to 15%, which is a killer when you start thinking about the rural customer, right? Who takes on that responsibility of that new increased price? Manufacturing in rural India manufacturing in India in general, of course, as a Atmanirbhar policy, has its goods and bads, because on a fundamental level, when you start thinking about the appliances and the manufacturing raw material, a lot of that raw material is still very much dependent on Korea, China, Japan, and other places. So when import regulations make it difficult to bring those products in, and import taxation's shifted so much in the last couple of years, we're stuck in a rock and a hard place, right? It's really hurting our supply chain and our ability to understand how to get the right products in. But then at the same time, government has made really interesting investments in Indian manufacturing. So we are being able to then bring in things like white labeled solutions, right? By working with OEMs in India and creating really innovative technology at a much lower price point with better margin opportunity. So it's been a really drastic shift. We are excited because we just signed 2 government contracts, but we've done it with the lens that I think everyone would say, non-financial. You don't want the government to be your payer at this stage, because you need to be able to have some control. But the beauty of these contracts is scale, right? They have it's credibility, it's scale, it's access to rural markets in a way that you could never imagine before. It's access to data, again, filling that gap in that loop, and infrastructure that I think can be game changing. And so if we're thinking future forward about platform and design, yeah, like we can open up markets to kind of come into the rural marketplace in a very different way. The challenge is, to Pratap's point, is when you are signing a non-financial MOU with the government, who's going to cover those 18 months of operational expenses to kind of build that platform, right? And so this is where blended capital has been playing a role. I think corporates have been playing a role. Marketplaces are starting to step in. So it's a wait and watch. We do get nervous about the politics around government, but I think what's exciting to see in our perspective is that, look, made in India, Atmanirbhar, Startup India, gender lens, these are policies that I think are going to stay for quite some time. And I think we should just really start figuring out how to navigate, how to unlock that opportunity further.
We talked about government and corporate participation. Pratap, you are trying to really work on the ground and maybe commercialize some of these innovations. If you see world over, for example, Stanford has just announced a School of Climate, and their goal is also to really get products out, right? Get innovative solutions out there. Do you see an industry academia partnership coming up which can really fuel, because a lot of these technologies need an academic environment, to really go from idea to commercial scale, and then governments maybe and corporates to get the scale outside. But as Climate Collective, are you working with any of the educational institutions or research organizations within the country?
Right. And maybe I'll just start with a quick observation. I'm a startup coach as well, and I also do startup coaching in clean tech in Europe, in particular in Switzerland. When you go to a Swiss cohort of clean tech entrepreneurs, 9 out of 10 are PhDs coming from a lab. When you come to India, it's much less so. And it's not because innovation is there. In fact, we see so many people ping us, asking us how to become a startup, who are working in a technical institute research. There's this one solution that came across in Hyderabad. It's a soil test. Anyone who does any kind of solar plants know that you have to go and do a soil test before you pile those mounting structures in the ground. It takes 2-3 days to get results. This was done through a 1-hour process using your cell phone. It's amazing now. Maybe it's early stages to see how well it tests, but this innovation is littered throughout the hundreds of technical institutes and academic institutes we have in India. It's hard for us to get them out. Licensing structures are the old ways. Can a professor or researcher leave their institute for 2 years to try a startup? Like MIT has a great, I think, structure to allow this to come back if it fails. I think there's a lot of potential we have in India, especially, I think you're mentioning the kind of the R&D work that we have, how to commercialize that. I think that's where we would see amazing stuff coming out of India. Right now, we have amazing stuff, a lot of applied solutions on the ground, which we need as well. I think to complement our ecosystem is this: how do you get it? How do you get this R&D out of these technical institutes into a startup format? Corporates may help here for sure. I don't want to be too biased against corporates. My wife used to be a product manager. Ex-wife used to be a product manager at a big financial services company, which had massive budgets for fintech. It had 100 times the budgets of a startup. Many resumes, top-notch schools, and just could not beat those small, spunky 2-3 person fintech startups coming out of India. It was impossible. So I do think that that's not a universal rule, of course. There's many good solutions coming out of corporates, but I do believe there is opportunities in this decade in particular, given what we've built over decades of support of research here on the ground to bring that out. And a lot of that research is clean tech. It is about our environment. It is about parts of agriculture efficiency, et cetera, resource efficiency, et cetera. So I'm quite excited to see how maybe it needs some government policies. Maybe it needs more aggressive institutes to support this kind of move to commercialize through a startup format or something. But I do believe that it would really enrich our ecosystem. I don't have any solutions here. I'm kind of, once I see a spark and something, I can come and help. But I am really looking forward to that.
So I have two observations, right? One is, and two anecdotes which I share, right? So right now I'm in the process of building a cell R&D lab in Bangalore. It's state of the art. I think it will be up and running probably in a month's time. I was speaking to my to one of the professors at IIT Bombay, and I was shocked to hear that IIT Bombay they have a cell lab. They can't get relative humidity. It's a technical term. You need a dry room for cell development. You can't go below 10%, and you need 1%, right? And I asked him, why can't you go to IISc or all these companies? And there's just no infrastructure, basic infrastructure which is in place. So which brings to my observation, which I've seen over the last decade or so. I believe that India will be a clean tech consumer, wherein the core R&D technologies, still bulk of those technologies will get built outside, because you have the ecosystem, you have the labs, you have the funding in place. And once these technologies mature a little bit, then I think what needs to be done is you need to have business model innovation of how you can adapt it to Indian requirements, right? So that, I believe, is I'm not saying that 100% of that would be this trend, but most of it would be that you would be clean tech consumer, right? And that's where I think the core R&D still, unfortunately, happens outside of India, especially on engineering side, material sciences, and what you have. And the second point, so that's from academia standpoint, I think we just need to build those linkages with outside institutions, and to really see how we can adapt it. Right? And the second piece, which I believe is historically the pool of capital, we had and that's why you saw, unlike US or Europe, where you have different types of funding, opportunities, right? Where people are willing to fund some moonshot initiatives like space exploration, which historically would not have happened in India, but now you are seeing some people who are playing some, really bets on the frontier side, which may or may not work, which will take probably 5 to 10 years, but people are able to raise capital, right? $10 to $20 million for space exploration, right? So I think the depth of the kind of capital which is available, I think it's improving. So like what Pratap is saying, now there's a whole angel network, because we are at that economic, there's been a lot of wealth creation in last 1 decade or 2 decades. And I think people are, we are going through that evolution journey. I don't think so it will happen immediately, but I think the pool of capital is getting deeper. And I hope, like to Anita's point, that soon the domestic capital becomes the major funder on sustainability. I think that will really put us on a different trajectory.
So one small thing is, I did not mean to apply that corporates can't work with academic institutes. By the way, I don't see Ola as a corporate. You guys have the spirit of a startup, no matter how big you guys get. So I think you can really bring in a lot of energy to a lot of other institutes here that need this spirit.
I can give a very straightforward example of contradicting, of course, that corporates do come in a really interesting way, right? I mean, especially if you look at the fintech space, right? I think some of the leaders are banks, corporate banks that are partnering with institutions like ISB, and then you're getting funded by organizations like Gates Foundation, and then the piece of that ecosystem is someone like a Frontier Markets, right, to connect the dots for innovation. So I do think if we design it, I think it's a really interesting way to make it happen, because I do also think that, especially in the clean tech space, you have giants in India that are corporates that have a vested interest in wanting to crack their next 1,000 crore market, which ultimately is about looking at going deeper and being more innovative beyond where they're already operating, right? And so I think a lot of people asked about the consumer piece. It is a really important point, right? When you're talking about this kind of country that has 1.4 billion consumers, we are actually in a pathway to leverage data to then dictate how corporates will have to rethink their approach to enter markets and build new business opportunities.
I think 1.4 billion consumer is a misnomer. India has 30 million consumers, which consume 80% of all the resources, right? So
whether I spend 100 rupees or 10,000 rupees, I don't think we should ever deny the inclusivity of the fact that you do have a rural population that is influencing consumption or consuming, which kind of brings my point about why rural India just cannot be ignored anymore, right? And it's why women cannot be ignored anymore. It's one of the reasons that we're saying that, like, there is an evolution that's happening, right? And if we start understanding the power of data that way, we will change our rhetoric, right? 100 rupees spent of even 50 million people is a market, right? And so I think this is where our mind needs to shift in order for us to really be disruptive, right? And I think that's the power that entrepreneurs should have, right? Coming in with that lens, right? So Ankit, come on. Even 10 rupees spent of a billion people is a market.
No, I believe the digital, I think the whole digital disruption and the cost of servicing 100 rupee transaction has become significantly lower, right? So I think it will happen. It is happening, and I think it has to happen.
I think there are a couple of questions on the chat and on Q&A on what are the different kinds of energy solutions which are decentralized, which can really take off. If anybody wants to take that, and I want to once get Anita in on the collaboration piece as well. But if anybody wants to pick up the question on, there's one on biomass-based energy solutions in rural. Maybe Ajaita, you can take that. And there is also a question on decentralized power distribution, and then some on the other chat as well. But maybe Ajaita, you can take that.
Yeah, so I'll take the biomass one fairly quickly. There are quite a few biomass alternative energy solutions that have been propping up depending on different regions of the country, really trying to look at localizing supply chains. So whether it's husk, whether it's dung, whether it's looking at so there is definitely been a lot of efforts in that space. CNG petroleum, absolutely. Like, we've had the Ujjwala scheme that's also come in to really start looking at LPG gas replacing poor wood usage of fire. I think the challenge that we've seen are two things. One is the design of the actual solution, and then marketing it to the right customer and incentivizing them to change their behavior. And then the second is generally just, again, it's an economies of scale issue, right? So we're seeing a really large CapEx investment on building these infrastructures, but then the solutions to get to rural, which needs to be priced at a certain way that actually allows you to take advantage of the masses, still is not happening. So there's a lot more work to be done, I think, to Ankit's point, on business model innovation and go to market beyond just what the R&D innovation can come out. And there's a lot of potential there. We just haven't really cracked it well.
There's also a question on decentralized power, right? Is that something that you think, Ankit? Yeah.
Yeah, Paula. So I think there are multiple solutions. Solar, of course, is the most dominant one, at least when it comes to electricity. I think the whole thing around storage, I saw some comment on storage. I think as the battery prices come down, right? Because lead acid batteries have been there for a long time. I think it's just the the storage is massively improving in terms of cost. And once you have firm power, which you will have to have with solar plus storage, I think that becomes quite powerful. So today what I see is there are a lot of solutions, and it's quite local. There are regional, I would say, entrepreneurs or shops or traders, who are putting that. I think there's a question around after sales service, which needs to be addressed. But in terms of solutions, I think there are, you have solar LED lights powered by solar panels, all kinds of solutions are there. But there's no branded, there's no national, one solution that works everywhere. The question is really, again, it comes to trust. And, if I'm paying for it, because obviously you save money on fuel, right? Your cost is effectively, your running cost is substantially lower. But the question really comes is, do you trust, right? Because people put, so in a large project, your discount rates would be, let's say 10%. When it comes to retail level, the discount rates get to 35, 40%, right? People want payback. They don't trust. LED is supposed to run 50,000 hours, but you go to any consumer, and this is, by the way, global phenomena, they really don't trust it. They want that, okay, if I paid for so much, I should get this recovery within 1 year or 2 years, right? And that really sets a very high bar in terms of from an adoption perspective.
It's also
Anita
designed just really quickly.
Sorry,
right?
I think Anita has to leave, so I want to ask her a couple, last comments. And also, Anita, quickly, there has also been talk of green financing, which is very popular, in other countries, and you see that having a green financing also helping, smaller companies come up with solutions, for the larger companies who have green financing maybe, and that will accelerate the sustainability as well. And also, since you are, I know you have to leave, so maybe just a last word on how you see this sector. We hope that we prove many McKinsey reports wrong, but what is just your best projection for the future?
Paula, and I apologize that I had a very sharp, hard stop, so I have to leave. I would say on green financing, we've seen an upsurge, especially on the debt side. And I would say for brownfield assets like renewable energy platforms, where we've had many of our platforms in India as well as globally issuing green bonds. And the whole green bond ecosystem over the last 10 years, I think, has become fairly established with known players for verification and all of that. Of course, a big question which even the government asks often as well as borrowers is, does that mean that we get it at lower cost? I truly feel that will start happening when there is a price to carbon. And that's a trend also that we are seeing, and I'm sure Pratap and others can talk about it. But a lot of companies themselves are having an internal price for carbon, and globally more and more markets are trending towards that. There'll be a lot of pushback for obvious reasons, but I think once carbon pricing gets internalized, that's when we'll really see green being cheaper in terms of financing costs. So that's one big trend. On the equity side, what I mentioned at COP26 with the SSB coming out with ESG standards, since there is a common language understood across the board globally on what do we mean by the E, the S, and the G, I think as that becomes more and more mainstreamed, I would see on the equity side as well that green, and we are seeing that already, there is a growing premium on brownfield renewable energy platforms. I'm starting to see similar trends in EV, which Ankit can confirm from a global point of view. In India itself, I still think there's there's a time lag, but I'm very confident that we are going to see the same trend in India, and at a scale, as Ankit and Ajaita have mentioned, that will be much, much larger than anywhere else globally. So that's also positive, both on the equity and debt side. In terms of financing, I remember, and this is one of the advantages of having been in the market for many years, I remember that, when the PE sector started taking off and the focus was on established companies, on growth opportunities, M&A opportunities, it's when the VC sector actually came alive that we saw all the innovation, creativity, and technology solutions, which, as you rightly said, Paula, is something that we really need to make sustainability happen at scale. And that's a trend that I'm now seeing also for green finance, where the big institutional capital is being accompanied by more innovative VC funds. And as I mentioned earlier, the clean tech VC funds in the US and in Europe are starting to go up the performance percentile in terms of returns. And that, I think, will be another boost to the sector in India as well, as investors get confident that they will get returns. And last point I'll make is that Bridgewater, which is one of the world's largest hedge funds, has done an analysis of listed companies, sustainable and sort of their normal portfolio. And the sustainable portfolio has done just as well as the others. So this whole myth that sustainability means you have to somehow pay more is slowly getting eroded. And the more we see carbon prices taking off, the more I think we will see this trend in sustainability becoming an opportunity. Thank you very much, and really a big thank you to my co-panelists. I love listening to each and every one of you, and I hope that your great work and the conversation will take things forward in India. Thank you, Paula.
Thank you so much, Anita, for taking the time and really sharing your rich experience. We have a couple of minutes, Ajaita. You can just finish your point and maybe a couple of last points from each one of you, and then we'll close.
So the only thing that I wanted to just quickly add in was around inclusivity, because I know we've covered it a few times in general, but this is going to be my chance to be able to say that where I think the biggest opportunity and also challenge exists today is when we're not putting a gender lens to some of the work that we're doing on the ground, especially when it comes to climate and sustainability, and especially if you look at this from a rural lens. Because the burden of electrification and consumption actually does sit with the women. So when we sit and we start thinking about where we're going to play a role of who influences climate shifts, we need to really start centralizing the conversation around what do we understand in terms of that woman's perspective, and how do we really bring that into our model in terms of business model design, data, and product design as well. And I think that it's going to be really exciting to see whether we can start aligning some of these elements: gender lens investing, climate gender lens, understanding where the role that inclusivity really plays in a larger market opportunity to take that to scale. And I think that obviously we as frontier markets are trying to lead that pathway, but we're really hoping that we can start getting others to come in with the same.
Ankit, Ola is doing very similar work, but again, last word from you on this as well.
So I saw the list of participants, and there are quite a few students and from people from academy, universities. I think there is a very important. This is, I think, one of the biggest problem, and as an entrepreneur, I see this as the biggest opportunity. So if you're really, so my only, I would say, one point which I like to make is, this is something which is going to impact everyone. It's a great career opportunity. Like, think hard about it. It's not going to be, it's more like a marathon. It's not going to be something which happens in 2 years or 3 years. But all I can say is we have all the right ingredients in place to make it an exciting, exciting journey for everyone. And we need more and more people. I think capital is not an issue. I keep hearing, as an engineer, I always used to think from technology perspective, but then when I went to Harvard, I was, the whole thing was people. And I do believe that we need to attract the best talent in this space, and problems will get solved, right? There are enough technologies out there. There are enough resources available. I think I would say, if you're taking a view on your career, I would say this is the best bet that you should look at, right? And it has a win-win for the society also at large.
Pratap, your call to action for the ecosystem.
Well, I'll just add on to what Ankit said, because there was a question about how startups and youngsters should or can play a role in sustainability in South Asia. And there's never been a better time. 20 years ago, it was a very lonely journey to be an entrepreneur. How do I find an investor? Who can help me learn how to do a financial model? It's much easier than it has been in the past. You'll probably still fail. That's the nature of entrepreneurship. Let's be really blunt about it. It's hard. Not all of us. It's definitely not me, as perhaps has the luck or skill of Ankit and Ajaita, who, if I'm not wrong, have done pretty well in one of their early ventures. I have heard of this one adage that I really love. It comes from Silicon Valley. If you want to be an entrepreneur, you have to be at bat 6 times, because each time you're learning. You're learning how to get better. It's a skill. And it's psychological. People are telling you, get a job, it's stable, you're making no money. Are you sure you're doing the right thing? And I think to maybe just finish with what Ankit said, it is something that could be very impactful. So if you're going to try it, do try it. Nothing's going to happen. You may fail, you may go back to the job later, but I think you'll be enriched by this process.
Great. Thank you so much. Thank you, all of you, Anita, Ankit, Ajaita, Pratap, and thank you to Asia Society and the team for really putting this event together with this wonderful panel and for very exciting discussion. I just want to end on a note, the gentleman, Mr. Mahatma Gandhi said, always decades ahead of his time, that it's time to review our relationship with nature. And it couldn't be more relevant today as we listen to all the work that's being done in this space. I'm sure we will accelerate and reach a new relationship with nature, which is more green. And on that note, thank you all the participants and all the attendees for the questions and for being a part of this dialogue. Thank you again.